Morning. So, Joe Rogan, free speech. I held off chiming in on this one for a while. Mostly because it's kind of standard culture war stuff. Like, yeah, some people are trying to cancel Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan said something outside the mainstream narrative. Like, so what, right? Joe Rogan put out on Instagram a 10-minute video just kind of, addressing the controversy. And I thought the video was really good, just kind of on a broader point about dealing with people on kind of like an individual basis, right? Like making your own assessment of somebody rather than just taking somebody else's word for it. And that's what I really took away from his video, right? I mean, he's there articulating really well, like, who he is, why he's doing what he's doing, and what he's trying to accomplish, and I think any genuine person would watch that and would be hard-pressed to come up with what's wrong with that, right? Especially when he talks about, the two main controversial videos. One is, a leading cardiologist is the most, cited, published cardiologist in the country or whatever. And the other one, Dr. Malone is the guy who, largely responsible for mRNA vaccines, right? He's got like 7 or 9 patents on the technology. It's not like he doesn't think the technology works, right? I mean, he helped develop it. He thinks it's important, right? But people just hear what the media says about these podcasts, don't go to the source themselves, and just kind of, make a judgment based on what other people say. And I get why that happens, right? I mean, we're all busy, especially, for podcasts. So unless you're really, into whatever you're watching, it's hard to devote an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Jesus. Just jump out in front of me, partner. It's hard to devote a big block of time to, sitting and listening to something that doesn't really grab you, right? And so you're going to use other trusted sources' opinion on a subject as kind of a shorthand. It's like, well, I like this person, I like their take on things, I like their politics. They don't like Joe Rogan, therefore, Joe Rogan bad, right? So I get why that happens, and we all do that, right? But, we should really discipline ourselves more, especially in this day and age, to go to the source before we come to any kind of conclusions. And that's kind of the opposite of what social media does, right? Social media is, especially like Twitter, is just, whatever the hot take is, the quickest, most, cutting jab that somebody can post is what's going to get traction and attention. And taking the time to articulate a more nuanced position is dull, it's boring, it's not going to get traction, but it's important, right? And listening to that long-form conversation, it's important. Hearing what people who are experts in their field, who have a dissenting opinion from the mainstream, have to say is important. Especially, and Rogan did a really good job of lining out, 6 months ago, this was misinformation. 8 months ago, this was misinformation. A year and a half ago, this was misinformation, right? And all these things are now accepted as true in the mainstream, but they were bannable offenses before, right? And there's never any mea culpa, there's never any acknowledgement that the people who were saying that at the time, in defiance of the quote-unquote science, were correct, or that the establishment had it wrong, right? And that's the real dangerous thing about all this. It's very Orwell. And again, I'm not the first person to point this out, but yeah, it's very 1984. It's very Ministry of Truth. It's very doublethink, right? Whatever is the convenient narrative at the moment for the establishment is the truth. And if that directly contradicts what the mainstream was saying 2 weeks ago, that is irrelevant. Whatever is politically expedient now for the powers that be is what is the truth. And that's a scary world to live in, right? And I talked in my first episode about, identifying objective reality, right? Objective reality exists. Like, if we have to make any assumptions about life, about the nature of existence, objective reality exists. There's a material world out there. It is quantifiable, it is testable, which is why science works, right? We can perceive things, we can hypothesize and then test hypotheses through experimentation and come up with working theories, in the scientific sense, theories, right, about how the world works, right? There is an objective reality. Now, you can play around the edges about, subjective experience, especially when it comes to humans. Fine. I mean, subjectivity is relevant, right? It matters. But if we're going to talk about what's true, especially when we're trumpeting the quote-unquote science all the time, right? When the science, the established science coming from the government and the mainstream media changes on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis, right? We got a problem as a society because we live into divergent realities. We got one group of people who, have a narrative of what life is and how life works based on, political ideology, and then the inverse, right? In another video I talked about, being the heretic and kind of bouncing between those polar extremes as I grew up and kind of settling to where I am now. And I do the best I can as a flawed human who doesn't have all the information to identify as best I can what I can point to as objectively true, right? And if we're going to talk about people's take on things and who is dangerous or who needs to be censored or whose information is misinformation, then we can't just fall back on that shorthand, right? That we go to the trusted source and just believe whatever they say. We've got to do our due diligence on our own and try and identify what's true and what matters, because people in general, in my experience, pay lip service to liberty, right? They pay lip service to the concept of free speech, but humans have a very authoritarian streak by nature, in my experience. And this is my subjective experience, but this is based on my observations of people. And what am I basing that on? All the times when I have received emergency calls from people because someone used mean words against them, and having to then go to that location, talk to that person, and explain to them how somebody calling them mean words is not a crime, but is actually protected speech under the First Amendment in the United States. And this blows people's minds, especially now that we have this concept of hate speech, right? Which, again, is just a fraught term in its own, right? It has a lot of ideological baggage that comes with it. But yeah, people have this concept that when somebody says something that emotionally harms them in some way, that this is a problem that needs to be appealed to the government, right? And the police are the average Joe's most direct contact with their government, right? If somebody interacts with their government on a day-to-day basis, usually it's the police, unless you're going into DMV or paying your taxes or whatever. Law enforcement is that frontline, most common level interaction with their government. And people call the police because they've identified something as a problem to them, and they don't know how to fix it, right? And you would not believe the sorts of things we get calls about, like, neighbor A has bushes hanging over the property line of neighbor B, and so neighbor B trims back the bushes to the property line, and neighbor A wants to call and make a criminal complaint about neighbor B, right? This is not criminal, right? This is a civil issue. And people don't get that there's two separate universes of law. You've got criminal law on the one side and a vast chasm between that and civil law on the other side. And the state, specifically law enforcement's authority lies almost entirely within the universe of criminal law, right? And so when we get a call from somebody about their neighbor using mean words against them, and having to explain, like, at an elementary level, that, like, unless they're making, like, an imminent threat, like taking active steps towards carrying out a threat, like they have the intent, that means they're acting with the conscious objective, they have the means, like some sort of weapon, and they have the opportunity, that is, they have physical access to your person, right? Intent, means, and opportunity is what constitutes an imminent threat, right? Unless somebody's making an imminent threat of serious physical harm, they can stand on their own property across the street and call you whatever they want, right? That is their right as a human being, and not just as a U.S. citizen, as a human being. Like, you can speak, and person across the street does not have the right to gag you, no matter what you want to say. And I mean, there's some very specific and well-established exceptions to that, and people, you know, bring those exceptions up, you know, especially like, you know, reports of, you know, imminent danger or emergencies that can cause panic to where people get hurt, right? And there's criminal statutes about that kind of conduct, or, you know, other forms of ongoing, unwanted, you know, verbal harassment that constitutes something like, you know, stalking. But just generally speaking, if you're having a beef with your neighbor, like, calm down, right? Be an adult, recognize that people are going to have a difference of opinion, and deal with it. And it doesn't matter if it's your neighbor using mean words, or the bald man on the podcast talking about things that you don't like because your preferred source of news says that person is bad. That's all I got. Catch you on the next one.